G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position with Guardian Australia and Essential Media, only on Australia Institute TV. In this episode, this show that we've got today, it's where we give you the inside story on what's going on in Canberra and what the public actually thinks, not what the pollies tell you that they think about the various issues consuming the national conversation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Coming up, we've got a lot more exciting webinars as per usual. We do them at least every week, but days and times do vary. So make sure that you go onto australiainstitute.org.au to find out all the latest times and register for future webinars. Next Wednesday, we'll be talking to ACTU Secretary Sally McManus about the wages crisis in Australia. And for those of you who had signed up to hear from former Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, we've had to postpone that until next Thursday at 6 p.m. So you should have got an email about that, but that's just a heads up if you were planning to join that. Just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our panelists. You should also be able to upvote questions from other people and leave comments. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it always gets posted on Australia Institute TV. That's our YouTube page where I really encourage you to subscribe. So I want to welcome everyone who's joining us from The Guardian or from Australia at home. And as always, joining us for this latest discussion of the Guardian Essential Poll is Katharine Murphy, the political editor of Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, executive director at Essential Media, John Remington from Essential, and our chief economist, Richard Dennis. And of course, as per usual, there's no shortage of news around. We've got states managing ongoing outbreaks. The vaccine rollout is still going at a snail's pace. The Nationals admitted that they're no longer the party of farmers. We've had another $500 million rorts scandal that just kind of we've seemed to have skimmed over, this time on car parks of all the things to have a rort about. Wasn't a contender in my mind, I'll tell you that. And last night we had the former Liberal MP Julia Banks give an extraordinary interview to ABC 7:30 about being groped, essentially, by a cabinet minister and detailing some of the toxic internal politics of the Liberal Party after Malcolm Turnbull was rolled again. So not a shortage of news. Katharine Murphy, I might start with you. We seem to have entered kind of another phase where the COVID numbers are dominating the news, but yeah, scandals, that extraordinary interview with Julia Banks last night, there's a lot happening.
Yeah, never a dull moment, certainly not at the moment. Yes, as Eb says, I think the main news really over the last sort of couple of weeks has been this incoming wave of COVID infections in major cities and lockdowns again in major cities. And that sort of has brought the community frustrations about the slow pace of vaccination or the slow pace of the vaccination rollout to the fore. And I think we see some of that dissatisfaction reflected in the poll numbers that we'll get into in a bit. As Eb said, yes, as well as COVID, there's all kinds of stuff going around. I described the Audit Office report about the commuter car parks scheme on the weekend in a column as 50 Shades of Bad, which is absolutely what it is. It's really quite extraordinary to see public funds expended in this way with very limited guardrails and with a process that was really no more complicated than MPs asking for what they wanted in their electorates. Really amazing, and has sort of been, as Eb says, slightly flattened by other big news. And we've also had Julia Banks, who has written a memoir about her brief stint in politics and the allegations that Eb pointed you to, certainly on the 7:30 report last night, and also in the memoir. And she's on a speaking tour about her book at the moment. So that's also rattling around. So, yep, quite a lot of things happening.
Yeah. And Pete, we've got the Guardian Essential poll out today. You've noted a bit of a drop in approval, but in your column today, you've described Scott Morrison as the Billy Joel of Australian politics. What did you mean by that?
Look, it's a controversial call because I know there's lots of people with a lot of love for Billy, including Katharine, given her little quoting of some of his less known lyrics on Twitter this morning. Look, I listened to this fantastic podcast about Billy Joel over summer from Slate's Hit Parade, where they made the point that the thing about Joel that you miss when you're wondering why the gap between his really good stuff and his really bad stuff is a chasm, is that he was a pastiche artist. He would take a trend, whether it was a sea shanty, which was, the Piano Man, or Motown, or ripping off REM. He basically took other people's music and remodeled it with a nicer melody. And I've been thinking about this for a while, looking at Morrison and trying to get my handle on why he succeeds in the polls regularly, and also why his support seems to me brittle. And if you look at him as someone doing pastiche rather than real leadership, I think it kind of makes sense. So it wasn't meant to denigrate Billy Joel, Katharine, or anyone else that loves him. It was to say that, you can have a great musical career with pastiche. You may not create a canon that's going to live on for generations, but as a leader, you probably need a bit more than that. And if you look at the great leaders in Australian politics, they kind of reinvented the game, whether it's Whitlam, Hawke Keating, even Howard. And Morrison fits more into a recent tradition of just leaders that haven't quite created anything new, a new sound. So you can go into the music geekdom a bit, but I just thought it was fun to play around with a bit of popular culture and try to get a few low digs at our Prime Minister.
Yeah. Katharine, is there anything, I guess, that you wanted to add to that observation?
Well, only just the defamation that was just reported there about my alleged views on Billy Joel. I just want to protest in the strongest possible terms. I will be engaging legal counsel, and you will be hearing from me, Peter Lewis. Anyway, but no, I think Billy Joel stands and speaks for himself, Eb, I reckon.
All right.
Once a year at Madison Square Gardens.
Okay, then. Well, I want to come back to the poll, I guess, and let's see if I can share the right version of the slides that we've come to. Can people see that? Is that coming up for everyone?
Yep.
Let's see if I can get my slide view up. So, Pete, we've had a bit of a drop in the numbers of overall. Do you want to just take us through this these first couple of slides?
So this is our kind of standing, I guess, health barometer for government that we've been running since the beginning of the pandemic, which is how do you rate the federal government's response to the COVID-19 outbreak? The critical thing is to combine those very good and quite good figures. And if you have a look at that journey, really through the worst of last winter and right through until to Easter, the combined has been well over 60. 22nd of April we're at 62. We're now down to 44 all up in positive, and that's the lowest it's been really since we couldn't work out if we were going to open up or lock down at the beginning of the journey. So 11% saying the government's doing a very good job, 33% quite good. When you're dealing with a significant public health and economic challenge, that's probably not where you want to be. If we go to the next slide, we'll also see drop-offs. And this is where I think it's quite interesting, and interested in Katharine's thoughts as well. So a few weeks ago when Victoria went down into lockdown, the federal government dropped off in Victoria but maintained its position everywhere else. It seems to me that this time it's dropping nationally, and particularly in Queensland. So that's been a significant drop-off in support for the federal government's response to COVID-19. Now, clearly, this is not voting intention. We think voting intention is by and large a crude tool this far out from an election. But what it's talking about is the atmospherics. And, in Queensland, at the end of last year, the federal government's response was 70% plus. It's almost, a third of that's been dropped off. over a 6-month period. So that does speak to some real issues with the public faith in the way the federal government's managing this crisis at the moment.
Not sure whose phone that is, but yeah, Katharine.
I'm buying the drinks. Sorry, guys.
Katharine, do you think that's really starting to bite the schmozzle that is the vaccine rollout at the moment in combination with new lockdowns, particularly in New South Wales?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, and look, public opinion is obviously flexible and events driven. So just because we're charting a decline right at the moment doesn't mean that it will be ever thus. And but look, I think the principal components of this story is people's lived experience with the vaccination rollout. I think people have sort of absorbed the message that the Commonwealth is responsible for the vaccination rollout, and Labor has been seeding this case about the Commonwealth responsibilities for quarantine as well. And so what we've seen is sort of a perfect little storm gather around that. I think it's people know it's difficult to get vaccinations, young people particularly worried about it. And people know that this program is rolling out slowly. There's also been confusing messages the whole way along about what's okay and what isn't, particularly around the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has created a lot of hesitancy. So that's sitting there. We're also in winter, where in a period where there has been infections coming out of hotel quarantine. People are starting to understand now that hotel quarantine was a stopgap solution rather than a permanent one, as Jane Holton said in her report many, many months ago. Now people are starting to be frustrated. People are starting to think that the Commonwealth just hasn't stepped up this year in the way that they did last year with all of the economic support. So I think that's what we're seeing, and that explains the sort of uniformity of sentiment about the federal government kind of falling off a little bit of a cliff there. The flip side, obviously, of the story is the government is, to the extent possible with supply problems, trying to get the rollout back on track. They're literally brought in the military to try and get the rollout back on track with the supply that we have in the country at the moment. The difficulty for the government is that, as Simon Birmingham said with commendable frankness late last week, Australia is currently at the back of the queue when it comes to Pfizer supplies. People will remember that Greg Hunt for a long time told Australians we were at the front of the queue. Well, no, right at the moment we are, according to the Finance Minister, at the back of the queue. So we expect supplies of Pfizer to enter the country in the last quarter of the year. And if so, if the government uses this period to beef up call it the inoculation infrastructure, right? These hubs, the GPs, brought on in order to be able to roll out vaccinations quickly, then the government may start to turn this in the last few months of the year. But a lot of this is sort of outside Scott Morrison's control, and this feels like quite a dicey period for the government.
Yeah, Richard, did you kind of read anything into those big drop-offs? Anything that stuck out to you?
Indeed. I think that, New South Wales has sort of been the pin-up for the Morrison government, for the Conservative press, the idea that somehow Gladys Berejiklian, ironically perhaps because of her overwhelming faith in the ability of the public sector, the overwhelming faith that she had in the contact tracers, the gold-plated, whatever we want to call them, that's sort of been the pinnacle. And also to some extent the easy way out for Conservatives in Australia to sort of say, we do take health very seriously. We're not trying to sacrifice your health, but we think all these Labor people that want to shut things down all the time have got it wrong. For over a year, Gladys has kind of given them a way to have a bob each way, and that's collapsed now. I'd be very surprised if the lockdown ends on schedule. It's been called lots of things. I think the mockdown, the essential toy stores remain open version of lockdown hasn't worked, and Yeah, that's going to raise all sorts of questions for how other states are going to behave. But I really think that Morrison has sort of got off lightly to some extent because he and others have been able to point to the New South Wales performance. And you see that collapse in support in New South Wales now for whether things are going well. That I think is going to have significant consequences for the federal government and significant consequences for how the other states deal with it. The short, sharp lockdowns are clearly the most effective strategy, but Morrison has always pretended to be opposed to them. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. Certainly Gladys has. Well, I think the evidence is in now.
Mm.
Just on the if you go to the next slide, Eb, to Richard's point,
Yeah.
I think last year there was a sense that the Australian people were giving their government a leave pass because things were so strange and weird and dangerous and scary, and they just wanted their government to succeed. I think the difference in particularly this lockdown is it's now being seen to be because of failures in federal government policy, and this chart shows that very clearly. The federal government is now being held responsible for the hotel quarantine system. And, you know, they're also being held responsible for the vaccine rollout. So there is a degree of accountability now in which lockdowns are a sign of the failure to deliver on core jobs. And I know that's been an argument that Labor has been moving, and Labor's changed its language. It was giving a leave pass last year because it's hard. These two lines are now starting to have a little bit of resonance from where I'm sitting.
Mm. Go to this next one now. I guess talking about it coming home to bite Scott Morrison a little more when he's been writing some pretty strong approvals for a long time now. Pete, what can we see in this slide here?
Well, the standout is there's still 51% approval of the job he's doing. So this is not like the show is over yet, folks. That is still, you know, for a sitting Prime Minister, not the worst numbers that anyone's ever going to have. But the number of disapproval is on the rise. It's the first time it's been in the, in the 40s really since the bushfires, and it's just at a bare majority now. I know John's got some specific gender breakdowns as well. If we want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, John, do you want to take us through this?
Yeah, so this is same results, approval of Morrison, but we've looked at it by men and women. On the left, we can see the women, and what we did see, and I think the conversation will move on to this a bit more, was a drop-off early in the year, which coincided with various scandals, allegations, and behaviour going on at Parliament House that Morrison was unable to address. And yeah, the approval amongst women dropped down from a high of 65% down to 46% in April. At the same time, if you compare that to men, it was very stable. So that was very much, he was there taking a hit amongst women. This week, we've seen the drop off from 61 to 53 amongst men. So the reaction to the lockdowns, and if that's what we're attributing this to, is very much amongst men. We've seen a little bit of a drop from women in 3%, but yeah, it's really amongst men where they're starting to react to what's happening.
Yeah, did anyone comment on that drop that we can see? No, we'll move on to the next one here. We've got the approval for Anthony Albanese. Pete, if there's anything you want to add to that, not much.
It's just remarkably stable. That, you know, the numbers sort of tend to get into the early 40s. I think the challenge for Albo is still that high number of undecided. A quarter of those, you know, we're all deeply into political game. I assume particularly those that are watching this webinar, we've all got a view of Albo. There is still a quarter of the population that don't. And I think the challenge is to move them into the positive camp. And that's what election campaigns are all about, when you force a choice. And it's really, you know, I think critical to Labor's chances to be defining what that choice is. And
yeah, not much of a change there in better Prime Minister either. So moving back onto the vaccinations, Pete, what have we got here? Is this hesitancy?
Well, it is only 51% are either saying that they're champing at the bit or they've already been vaccinated. So that doesn't get you on any pathway to anything approaching a 70 to 80% number. 33% sort of kicking it down the road, and still that 16%, which is, you know, it's high, of people that will never get vaccinated. So that says that if you really want to get into that sort of 80% zone where lockdowns are no longer a part of life, everyone else needs to be vaccinated. And that's all now about both access and urgency. And so there is an infrastructure logistics challenge, and there's a message challenge. And I don't know about Katharine and Richard, but I'm still amazed there hasn't been that, I don't know if you get Simon with two eyes back or what, but like that national advertising campaign on a public health crisis to really galvanize the mood that something needs to happen, and that thing has to be people rolling up their sleeves and putting stuff in their arm.
I don't think it's an accident. I think the existence of a big, highly visible campaign would simultaneously force Scott Morrison and the Morrison government to own the nature and the extent of the problem. And this might be cynical, but I think that vaccine hesitancy is good for the government because it allows them to, in typical neoliberal fashion, blame us for their failure. So
Yeah.
if you accept this as a public health problem, the number one public health problem, which makes it the number one economic problem, and it's all on the government to fix, then Scott Morrison is clearly a dismal failure. But if it's us that have become hesitant, and he, the kind of neoliberal who in this sphere doesn't want to tell us how to run our lives, even though he's very happy to tell us who we can marry and when we can die and all sorts of other things, they're kind of maintaining this kind of libertarian delusion while implementing a very old neoliberal strategy of blaming us for their failures. So agree, other countries have done it far more successfully. Yes, it's important, we should do it, but I think we need to ask, why haven't we? And I think if we did, it'd be everything would be at the Prime Minister's feet.
Katharine, I was going to ask you about the latest outbreaks have really thrown more attention onto, the lack of the rollout, the fact that there's such a small percentage of people that have had 2 jabs, but even still 18 months into this pandemic, it wasn't mandatory for aged care workers to have vaccinations. How much are those earlier decisions really coming home to roost now and in a negative way?
Well, I've just got a simpler version of Richard's theory for why there's no advertising campaign. There's no advertising campaign, or a negligible one, because there's no supply. That's the problem. You can't. No, but it's that sort of that call to action problem, right? You can't at the moment, if you're the Commonwealth, launch a really a very present and consistent call to action for vaccinations, because there's not the supply. There's not enough product in the country. Now, I think their advertising will ramp up as supply ramps up. There's also one other complexity in Australia, which is that we don't, as they do in some other countries, we don't advertise health products in Australia in the way that they do in the States and in other places. They've had to adjust the guidelines slightly in order to start to put this public information campaign together. So anyway, look, the ads still might be crap when they come. They may encourage you to not do anything at all and do nothing apart from hit the snooze button, which is the sort of version of the ads that are around now. But I just think there's a basic issue there. There's no ads because there's no supply. In terms of the, not no supply, that's a ridiculous overstatement, but you know what I mean. In terms of the earlier decisions coming home to roost, well, look, there are some genuine head scratchers here. And the aged care and disability care and other workforces is really one. Now, the government has said basically that in relation to not inoculating the workforce, that they were following the AHPCC. I always get that acronym wrong, I'm sorry, the health advisors. they were following their advice, and their advice, the health advisors, was vaccinate the vulnerable cohort first, i.e. disabled people and also elderly people, who are the most likely cohort of people to die from this virus. And then if you inoculate the vulnerable cohort, even if the workers bring it into the centre, then the vulnerable cohort are protected. That was sort of the reasoning, the rationale behind that decision. And there was also a practical problem, which we've discussed on this forum before, Eb, that basically what the pandemic has done is sort of accelerate and hold a lantern over sort of structural problems in our economy and society, as it has all around the world, right? We have a very vulnerable aged care system because of chronic underfunding and because of the hodgepodge of regulations that have sprung up around it. We've got a serious workforce problem. There's not enough workers available to work in this sector. People don't want to work because it's tough work and it's not well paid. One of the issues that the health advisors were kicking around in their minds was what would be the impact of mandating a vaccine in this workforce? Would people depart the industry? Would people refuse to show up to work if they had to have a vaccination? And then what would happen to elderly people? So look, I understand that these are really difficult conundrums that health advisors and governments have been grappling with right throughout this pandemic. I mean, some of these decisions are really genuinely difficult, but still it is surprising to me that that workforces would not be front and centre in your inoculation strategy, because while ever the workforce is not inoculated, you've got vulnerabilities. And we see that in the latest outbreaks at the moment. So now they're sort of running behind events again, trying to mandate it and work out how you can do that. And now everybody might have to have a vaccination by September, but it's all a bit of a mess. But anyway, I just wanted to sort of tease out some of those background issues that may not be obvious to people just sort of monitoring the daily coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Katharine. I'll go back to the slides in just a tick, but I wanted to come back to you, Richard. Katharine's highlighted a lot of workforce issues in aged care there, as well as, that they're poorly paid and all those kinds of things. The government's been spending money like it's going out of fashion, which is unusual, but hasn't seemed to have fixed a lot of these problems in the last 18 months. What do you attribute that to?
Look, I'll come to that in a sec, but just firstly, I agree with what Katharine said before. They don't want to advertise because there's a lack of supply, but I still think that if we're talking about vaccine hesitancy, we're not talking as much about the lack of supply. Perhaps should have been clearer, but yeah, advertising would drive people to a product that's not on the shelves. It's a joke. Look, as Katharine said, we've got a very poorly paid aged care workforce. It's casualised, people having to work in multiple centres in order to cobble together a living wage. Again, this kind of 20 years of neoliberal reform in aged care has made this precarious workplace, which is now a very precarious public health place. And we only need to go back to the Royal Commission to see really what we need to do about it. And of course, we only had a budget 6 weeks ago that basically ignored the Royal Commission's recommendations. So the whole point of having a Royal Commission was to ask what's going on here and what can we do about it. The Royal Commission said, you need to pay these staff a lot more money. You need to train them better. You need far better oversight of their employers. Here's what's going on. Here's how to fix it. And, in true Morrison government style, they kind of nodded at the time that it was in the papers and said, yes, we'll look at that. And we just had a budget where they didn't do that. So yes, we are spending an enormous amount of money at the moment. That's fine. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We can afford that. But our government has chosen not to spend it in the ways the Royal Commission recommended. And as Katharine said, you got low paid people working pretty hard. All of a sudden, we're going to start telling them what they have to do. There'd be a lot of fear that they'd lose some of their workforce. And how are we going to replace it? Well, Economics 101 says pay them more and more people will come, but the government just chose to not take on that recommendation.
So coming back now to these last couple of slides, Pete, we've got here how people feel about the government's protection of Australians. What can we see here?
Well, you know, this is the breakdown in trust in the federal government for all the reasons we've been speaking about. That's not a great number for the government to, in the middle of, or the tail end, or wherever we are in this strange event. The sense that the government's doing enough to protect Australians is falling away, and that's been the main strategy for the government to date, to put the public health of its citizens first. I think this is an interesting one, though. So we've been talking a lot about the federal politics in New South Wales. A majority of people are basically giving the New South Wales government a leave pass. There was a lot of talk about letting the virus run until the lockdown occurred for 2 weeks. We don't know whether there'll be an extension yet. I thought, interestingly, the new Labor opposition leader, Chris Minns, has been at pains to be a bipartisan rather than critical of the government. And even when the lockdown was extended, the opposition said, we're going to back in the government on this call. So there hasn't really been an opposition to the New South Wales government over this lockdown. And it's obviously part of the resilience of their numbers.
Yeah. The next slide we've got is looking at the economic recovery, and you've got a bit of a time series happening here from early to late last year. Did anything stand out from you in these results?
Look, I think there is this sense, that, the other thing with this number is that the 2-3 months is a moving feast. These timelines are moving feasts. So a question asked in April last year, how long it's going to take is 6 or 12 months ago. But what it says to me is that people still think that we've got a fair way to go on this journey.
Richard, is there anything you want to add about the economic response there?
Look, I think that generally, because the government spent so much money, we talk about the economy bouncing back. It didn't bounce back. It was dragged through the mud by enormous Keynesian stimulus. That stimulus has worked. It's interesting. We ask people, how do you think the economy is going to perform? When I read those questions, my head goes straight to, well, it depends what the government does next. So if the government's determined to rein in its spending, then we're going to stay lower for longer. If the government keeps pouring money in, perhaps because there's an election coming next year, then, we might see the Keynesianism continue. But certainly the large parts of the economy aren't snapping back. They never were. But the tourism sector, the higher education sector, huge parts of the entertainment industry are still basically locked out of the economy. So, parts of the economy are doing very well because the government spent so much money. That's good. But there's huge parts of the economy that are still not just struggling, but, broken.
Yeah. Katharine, the next slide here looks at who's having a good or bad year. Your personal financial situation stuck to me as a bit lower than in previous years for obvious reasons. But is there anything else that you kind of read into that jumped out at you?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's just, it's sort of a graph that's sort of tracking real lived experience again, isn't it? It's sort of like, obviously we've had the first recession in 30 years. That makes people a bit more worried about their personal financial situation than they would be in an ordinary year. Everybody's going to have a small business story. Poor places hanging on by their fingernails, obviously through the pandemic, through lockdowns and so forth. It's sort of interesting, I guess, that the up, down, up kind of perceptions of the economy is sort of interesting. And then, corporations, I guess people are more sort of, I don't know, I guess people are more focused on their immediate lived experience than an abstraction of a big companies travelling right at the moment. It sort of feels a long distance away from people, I would think, how or, whether large companies are or aren't doing fabulously during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Can I just say on that, Ed, that it feels to me that that last slide is a bit of a counterpoint to this narrative that we're going to be a happy hermit kingdom for the next, 20 years. And that there's this thing that, we're doing fine because of the stimulus money and we're all traveling locally and everything, we don't need to think about what comes next. And I know that before the latest lockdown, Morrison was trying to cling on to that with borders will be closed for a while, but I just found those numbers interesting, that people aren't saying things are going swimmingly at the moment.
So we've got about 750 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to come to questions from the audience now. And the top one is from Michael Bird. And I think this one is maybe for you first, Pete, and then Katharine, you might want to chime in. Why do you think the public's voting intention is barely influenced by scandals such as sports rot and the car park issues? Pete, do you want to take that one first?
I don't think that voting intention tends to shift on one particular issue, but I wouldn't rule out that it can build a narrative that can have an impact in the longer term. Sports rorts had a moment and it had a scalp, and that scalp has now been reattached, I guess, to the hairline. I don't know how you describe that, but you know what I'm saying. And now we've got the car parks. One observation is that for a government with, that's vulnerable for having no plan, it does seem to be very good at planning boondoggling in marginal seats. So they're, at least in terms of a level of competence in delivery of a strategy, when it comes to throwing money at the seats they've got to win, they're countering that narrative.
Katharine, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a couple of points. I think Pete's sort of point about building a narrative is right. Like, I despair, and again, in the column I wrote at the weekend, it's sort of like, it seems like to some degree, now the government is kind of immune from public embarrassment on this stuff. It's because things recur, and it's sort of, I scratch my head. I think, how can that happen? But anyway, what the polling shows us this week, in terms of the story about Scott Morrison, is the story of what happens to you when you hang around in politics for longer. What happens is your negatives start to build up. And that's what we could go back and show you that chart today about the Prime Minister's negatives starting to creep up. Now, some of this might be situational. And of course, again, returning to that point, he has a 51% approval rating. You would rather be him than Anthony Albanese at this point in time. You would absolutely rather be the government than the opposition at this moment in time. But the thing about Morrison that is tricky for him is if these negatives start to creep up. Anthony Albanese's problem is that there's a big chunk, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the country that doesn't have a view on him at this point in time. The difficulty for the Prime Minister is that views may start to form amongst voters that are not necessarily favourable. So then you get into difficulties like the vaccination program's not what they promised. Hotel quarantine is their responsibility, and yet they won't do anything about it. Or that car parking thing sounds a bit sus. That's when you start to take on water as a Prime Minister. So it may not have a sort of an effect that we can draw a chart on, right? On Wednesday, the 15th of April, this happened, and then it led to this. It's not a science. It's kind of like, it's a bit of an art, but I think that's the vulnerability of the Prime Minister. If you want to do a tale of two leaders at the moment, you've got Anthony Albanese's problem being a large, chunk in our survey doesn't know what to think of him. Morrison's problem is that those negatives are starting to creep up. And that is problematic for any leader.
Richard, the Australia Institute's done obviously a lot of work around transparency and accountability and trying to push for a federal corruption watchdog. The government's come on board with quite a weak model for that, but we have seen kind of scandal after scandal. This last one shocked me, not only in how huge it was, but the mundane thing over which like car parks, even compared to the sports rots where, local sporting clubs were getting something, it seems such a banal thing to rot taxpayer money over. Richard, sorry, that one was for you. Oh, have we lost him? Might have lost Richard there. We'll come back to that one, but yeah, I just given the amount of Australia Institute research showing support for a corruption watchdog, it's clearly an issue that bites a lot with the public, and as Katharine said, I think probably does add to the negatives over time. The next question that we've got here is from Sophia McGrain. She asks, what's Katharine's view on why Morrison has been so resistant to establishing federal government quarantine facilities? Her theory is the cost, not just the build cost, but also ongoing staffing and etc. What's your response to that one?
Yeah, well, I think cost is part of it, because we have had this strange dynamic where the Commonwealth has spent literally eye-popping amounts of money, yet we've also had this sort of periodic nickel and diming over expenditures, which sort of doesn't, on the face of it, make a lot of sense in an environment where the government's spending as much as it has been. So yes, I think cost is part of it. I think also, like on the giving people the benefit of the doubt side of the equation, obviously, these quarantine facilities are optimised if they're in particular places. There's been criteria like the government wants proximity to a tertiary hospital, can't be a defence property because, the defence need their own properties, this, that, and the other thing, which has sort of added up to some inertia, sort of all of that thinking about, oh, well, it's too hard. But also I think there's just a basic thing of political responsibility, and it is very interesting that we see that sort of shift in where voters are attributing blame. I think the Commonwealth view, or the Morrison government view, is that hotel quarantine, while it's in hotels rather than the dedicated federal-run facilities, if there are outbreaks, that is something the states wear. That is a matter that where the blame can be sheeted home to someone other than the Commonwealth. Obviously, if people return to Commonwealth-run facilities, then the blame shifts back. And I think that has been, well, look, I shouldn't say I think, I should say, I should be more accurate than that. Certainly there are people at the state level that think that has been a significant barrier to entry, that the Commonwealth doesn't want to build these facilities because it doesn't want to own the political responsibility for outbreaks, whereas at the moment the states own that. So it's a sort of complicated picture. I think it's partly the nickel and diming, it's partly this issue is complicated because you've got to put facilities in locations where they will work, and I gather, like, just getting a workforce for Howard Springs has been quite difficult for the government. That's obviously in the Northern Territory. So there are practical issues, but then there's that political blame shifting calculus that I've walked you through as well.
Yeah, Katharine, this next one's for you as well. And then Richard, I can see you're back with us. I might jump to you. So I talked at the very beginning about the Nationals no longer being the party of farmers. Weren't they formerly known as the Country Party, asks Michael S. Goodman.
Yes, they were. Funny that. What Eb's referring to is an interview that I did with Matt Canavan at the weekend. It's not only, I think that this has been around in dispatches as well, but certainly I engaged with Matt Canavan, who used to be the Resources Minister, was on the front bench when Barnaby Joyce was last leader of the Nats, now sits on the backbench and is apparently content to stay there. We had a long conversation on my podcast, which dropped on Saturday, about net zero leadership, all kinds of stuff, but it was very much predominantly focused on climate and our very different views, his and mine, about climate change and the urgency associated with action. And during the course of that, he said, oh, look, because we were talking about the opportunities in farming, I was trying to present to him a notion because Matt seems to think the only sort of legitimate economy is a carbon intensive economy, that there can't be another type of an economy. So I was trying to present ideas to him that, look, farmers, actually there are benefits from climate change for farmers. There's soil sequestration, there's income streams out of, sort of putting vegetation back on land, all of this sort of stuff. And it was in the course of that Matt Canavan noted that the National Party was not the farmers' party farmers were actually a very small proportion these days of the Nationals' core constituency, and the inference being, well, therefore, why, we don't need to worry about that. Well, those comments have been picked up certainly by the Land and by others and have gone around the place. So it'll be very interesting to know how that message is going down in National Party heartland, because I reckon there'd be a few farmers who might have a different view about that.
Yeah. Richard, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and sorry about the technical problems before. Look, there's a great interview a couple of years back now where Waleed Ali spoke to former Nationals leader Michael McCormack and said, can you name one instance where you prioritise the interests of farmers ahead of the interest of miners? And the Deputy Prime Minister said, no, I can't think of one. Let's be clear, the National Party support fracking for gas on prime farmland when farmers oppose it. The National Party support building coal mines on farmland when farmers oppose it. So, I think it's refreshingly honest of Matt Canavan to say, yeah, no, we're not really kind of the farmers' party anymore, because they haven't acted in the farmers' interests for decades, both ignoring climate change and literally prioritising the interests of the mining industry. And just quickly back to the question you asked before, we're talking about the pork barrelling. Let's be clear, what's happened with the sports rorts, what's happened with the car parks, this is National Party politics 101. I mean, for decades, the kind of implicit contract in the Liberals and the National Party was that the Liberals just spent far too much money on marginal National Party electorates, just gave them lots of money to kind of pork barrel. And this is, I think, what people don't understand. The strategy in handing the money over is to attract criticism, right? Part of the National Party's strategy is to be criticised for succeeding in getting far too much money for their electorate. So when Labor comes out and says, oh, look at the National Party with all these boondoggles, look what's happening, that's actually reinforcing the view that the National Party are delivering for their constituents. Well, now we're seeing exactly the same thing with Liberal backbenchers. They want to be criticised for winning money for their car parks. They want to be criticised for getting money for their sporting clubs. It's proof in the micro-targeting that they're obsessed with amongst the 5 or 10% of swinging voters they're after. It's proof that they're doing their job. So we can evaluate the policy, we can suck air over our teeth and talk about the lack of cost-benefit analysis, but let's not pretend for a minute that there aren't excited backbenchers out there loving being criticised for attracting money to their electorate that they didn't deserve. That's the plan, to say we didn't deserve it, but I got it for you.
Yeah. Pete, did you want to add anything to that?
The other thing that strikes me is that we shouldn't discount the benefit of getting away with having an internal opposition within a government. At the moment, we've got this coalition government where the Nats can go really hard and quite ferally and not get their issues by and large up, but say we're fighting the fight. And the government also manages to accommodate those views while continuing to keep their inner city softer liberal base thinking that this government's got things under control. So I think structurally they've managed to pull off something that really does work in their favour.
No, it's certainly proven to be a coalition that can withstand quite a lot over the years and quite a fair bit of internal divisions as well. Kimberly Wheeler's question is, what would it take to have reported issues of behaviour towards women actually investigated independently? Thinking there of the Julia Banks interview, but also of reports against Barnaby Joyce and earlier reports against Christian Porter. Katharine, where are we currently in terms of what the PM has promised? Any changes made to the way things work up in Parliament? Over to you.
Well, bumping along is the answer. We are bumping along. The government has engaged Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, say that 10 times quickly, Kate Jenkins, to do a review of workplace culture in Parliament and make some recommendations. We've also had Stephanie Foster, who is a DepSec in Scott Morrison's department, put forward a proposal for an independent complaints mechanism in the Parliament, which sounds like nothing, but in this place is actually something, because at the present time, staff in the Parliament do not have normalised HR arrangements. If they're treated very poorly in offices, they have to run the gauntlet of their own office or their party processes. So something approximating a normalised HR function in the Parliament is a bigger deal than it sounds. So that is also kind of kicking around. Interestingly, I did speak to Julia Banks and in the story I filed last night after the 7:30 report interview, and I think he's still on the website at the moment if you're interested, is I asked her whether or not she would make a submission to the Jenkins Review, because she has made an allegation against a colleague, but she hasn't named that colleague, as well as talking about an environment of sort of, boys' own politics, call it that sort of prevails around the place. I was interested whether or not she might raise a more specific allegation in the Jenkins Review, because some care was taken to make sure that people's submissions would be kept confidential. And that was very important to a lot of parliamentary staff who were planning on making submissions. But Julia Banks said no, that she will send a copy of her memoir to Kate Jenkins, but that she doesn't intend to be interviewed or to make a submission. And her reason for that was, and she was at pains to say that she was had enormous respect for Kate Jenkins, both as a professional and as a person. So it wasn't a slight on the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, but she said, I just don't have sufficient confidence that material will be confidential through this process. And she alluded to that sentiment being widely held. And I think there is a certain amount of concern around the place about how frank people can be in these interactions. But anyway, so that's a long dispatch from me that says, look, we're bumping along, we're moving. I'm more optimistic, actually, that we'll get a better set of arrangements here. I mean, culture is another issue. Culture is an entirely separate issue. But in terms of nuts and bolts, I'm more optimistic that we'll get a better set of arrangements here for staff than has been the case in the past. And if that happens, that will be positive. But of course, there's a whole conversation to have in the community about why women don't report these things, why they don't come forward, why even when they do come forward, many women decide not to prosecute their own allegations of sexual assault. That's a whole other conversation about the justice system and the incentives in the justice system. And that requires basically, our Minister for Women in Canberra and also state justice ministers taking that structural bias in the system much more seriously than they have done in the past.
Yeah, and certainly quite apart from the justice system, we can see in Parliament that there's very few consequences for men that engage in this kind of behaviour, and it's the women who come forward that often seem to carry that burden, not only of the behaviour that was inappropriate towards them, but then, impacting on their careers for a lot longer, certainly than it seems to have impacted men who've had allegations against them. Katharine, Ed has a question for you about how long you think the government can push back against the tide of the energy market shifting to renewables. Do you think the electorate will push back, considering they will suffer if they're left out of the transition?
Oh, Ed, you want to drive me crazy. How long can they push back? Well, forever. Sadly, they can push back forever. While ever they've got a formula for winning elections by pushing back, they can push back forever. Even though they are, I'll be a bit more upbeat. Look, the government is under pressure on two fronts to try and make their climate change policy less horrendous than it has been over the last 10 years or so. The pressure is coming internationally from leaders leaders who are important to Australia, countries that are important to Australia, i.e. the UK and America and Europe. And also there is the simple fact that our trading region, China, Japan, South Korea, that we have clicked over into a net zero trading region. Global capital has made a choice. We've clicked over, it's happening. The transition is on, whether or not Australia wants it or not. And the only question remaining about this transition is whether it'll be orderly or whether it'll disorderly. It's done. This is over. But the government can continue to frustrate action at the federal level for as long as it feels as though it can win an election by telling people in regional Australia that nothing has to change and they're the champions of fossil fuels, and telling voters in the cities, oh no, actually we're pivoting on climate action, and now we might sort of maybe, possibly, preferably, who's to say, do something like achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So, I mean, this is the kind of nexus that has to be broken in the country for anything to change, at least on the Liberal and National Party side of politics, sadly. So, anyway, that is my honest answer.
Yeah, Richard, do you want to add to that?
Look, yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think really the decisive voice that's strategically and pathetically silent about this at the moment is, of course, the business community. If the business community is serious about low energy prices, if the business community is serious about investment certainty, the business security should be the ones driving right into the heart of the Liberal and National parties and saying enough is enough. But as long as the business community are kind of stuck in this obsession with industrial relations reform and company tax cuts, they basically keep getting snookered by the coalition, who say, well, we'll give you the company tax cuts, we'll give you the IR reform, but not if you're going to push us on renewables. So really the business community needs to actually lead. It needs to speak up for what it really knows is in its best interest. But groups like the Business Council of Australia, which aren't, of course, a business, it's just a lobby group, they've kind of built up this convenient consensus over decades where you don't kind of poke the bear. Well, it's going to affect the competitiveness of Australian business, and the longer the business community sit on the sideline, the longer the Libs and Nats can get away with this politically convenient dance based on an economic fiction.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid we might have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us, Katharine Murphy, Pete Lewis, John Remington, and Richard Dennis. We appreciate all your insights today. Thanks for all your great questions, everyone. Again, always sorry we can't get to more of them, but huge interest in the webinar today. So thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to Australia Institute TV. That's our YouTube channel, where you can find all recordings of previous poll positions, as well as our other webinars, all completely for free and accessible to the public. And don't forget to check out our podcast, Follow the Money, where we explain the big economic issues in plain English. A couple of recent episodes include Richard Dennis talking to me about Mark Vail's decision to step down from being Chancellor of Newcastle University and the political implications of that, as well as plenty of other interesting topics to cover. We take big economic issues and explain them in plain English. Please tune in for that. Stay safe out there, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next week when we speak to Sally McManus. Take care.